The light that comes off a November field in Dark County doesn't arrive so much as it settles low flat without ambition, the way a man sits down who has already decided nothing good is going to happen. Hollis Vane had been standing at the east fence line for 20 minutes. The light hadn't changed in all that time. It had simply pressed itself against the ground and stayed there, gray and final, the color of a decision already made by someone who wasn't going to explain it. She was 19 years old. She had driven 4 hours from Columbus in a truck with one working defroster and a registration sticker expired since September. She had a folder on the passenger seat with the results of a soil test. She hadn't yet learned to fully read 11 acres of ground in front of her that looked like it had given up on the idea of ever growing anything again nowhere else she needed to be. The field ran east from the fence line in broken rows of old corn stubble. The stalks snapped and darkened by 2 seasons of weather, no one having bothered to disc them under. The soil between the rows was the color of old ash, not brown, the way working ground is brown, not dark with moisture or organic matter, but a gray-brown that suggested something leached out and abandoned. Even the field edges were bare. No ragweed, no volunteer anything. Just clay running down to more clay at the fence posts. The posts themselves leaning at angles nobody had corrected in years, the wire between them slack enough to push inward with one hand. To the north she could hear a tractor running. The sound came low across the flat ground, a diesel knock. She recognized as something larger than anything parked in the equipment shed behind her. Harlan Pruitt's operation was working the bottomland, the 62 acres her grandmother had signed over in 2018, the ones with drainage tile laid at 30-inch intervals and 12 inches of river deposit loam and everything else that separated ground worth farming from ground that merely existed. She could hear it. She couldn't see it. That distance felt correct. That ground was not hers. It never would be. She had come back to Dark County 10 days after the lawyers finished with the estate paperwork, because there was nothing in Columbus worth staying for, and because the alternative to coming back was letting the county assess the property for back taxes and watching whatever remained dissolve into someone else's arithmetic. She was her grandmother's only grandchild. The farmhouse, the equipment, the 11 acres of exhausted ground, the 1998 Silverado with 214,000 miles on the odometer, and a passenger-side defroster that had surrendered sometime during the second Bush administration, all of it had passed to her in a document that took 12 minutes to read aloud and 37 years to accumulate. The extension office in Greenville had been her first call after the lawyers. She hadn't known it was the right call. She had known she needed someone to look at the ground and tell her in plain language what she was dealing with, and the extension office was what she found when she searched for soil testing in Dark County, Ohio. The man who answered was named Vernon Hatch. He had a voice like someone who had delivered difficult news many times and learned to do it without much inflection, because inflection was where people got confused about whether there was still room for hope. He came out on a Tuesday in late November with a soil probe sampling bags, a clipboard he carried under his arm the way men carry things they've carried for decades. He walked the east field in a grid pattern she hadn't asked him to explain, 4 quadrants cores at even intervals, each one labeled before moving to the next. He worked without speaking. She followed at a distance. When he finished, he sat on the tailgate of his truck and filled out the submission form by hand. The temperature was 34 degrees. The wind came from the northwest. Neither of them mentioned either fact. She asked what he thought. Vernon Hatch looked at her over the top of his clipboard, then looked back at the form. "I think we'll know more when the lab comes back." He paused just long enough that she understood the pause was doing work the words weren't. But the surface structure isn't where you want it. The compaction is visible in the core samples. There's a hard layer starting around 8 inches that the probe didn't want to pass through. That's not frost compaction. That's equipment compaction, repeated, over multiple seasons without remediation. He submitted the samples to the lab in Worcester, told her she'd have results in 10 to 14 days. They came back in 12. Vernon Hatch handed her the printout across his desk on a Friday afternoon and sat quiet while she read it. The county seal at the top. Below it, the numbers in a column she read twice: pH 5.1. Organic matter 0.4%. Compaction noted at 12 inches. Atrazine residue detected, concentration not quantified. Cation exchange capacity at the low end of the range for clay-heavy soils. She understood some of it. The pH she understood because her grandmother had written about pH in the margins of things. Birthday cards, grocery lists, once on a napkin tucked inside a cookbook in the farmhouse kitchen. The number Cora had always been working toward was above 6.5. The number on this page was 5.1. Vernon Hatch watched her face with the particular stillness of someone who has decided not to lead, who will let the information arrive at whatever speed it can. She asked what 0.4% organic matter meant in practical terms. He took a measured breath. It means the soil biology is impaired. At that level, the microbial activity that makes nutrients available to plant roots is significantly reduced. You can have nutrients present in the soil and still have crops that can't access them, because the biology that converts those nutrients into plant-available forms isn't functioning. He looked at the printout. It also means the soil's water-holding capacity is compromised. In a dry July, ground at 0.4% sheds moisture instead of retaining it. She asked what healthy ground in the county ran. Between 3 and 4% for most of the agricultural land in this region. Some of the better river deposit soils run higher. He set the clipboard on the desk. The worst figure I've seen on actively farmed ground in Darke County in 11 years was a field that had been flooded twice and left fallow for 3 seasons. That came back at 0.6. He said it the way a doctor tells you something difficult while watching your face tracking what you can absorb without breaking. Hollis absorbed it. She folded the printout and put it in her jacket pocket. She thanked him and walked out to the parking lot and sat in the Silverado with the driver's side heater running, watching a slow condensation work its way up the passenger side windshield from the bottom corner. Cold air from the broken vent meeting. Warm air from her breath, building a gray film across the glass in front of the empty seat. The field didn't look dead. It looked spent, which is a different thing entirely. She drove back north. The east field appeared on her right as she came off County Road 25A into the farm lane. She looked at it through the windshield, the gray stubble rows, the clay, the color of old aluminum, the fence posts at their slow, wrong angles. She looked at it the way you look at a problem you haven't yet decided whether to solve. Not walking away, not yet committed. 19 years old, $12 in her checking account. The November light already failing at 3 in the afternoon. She went inside. She made coffee in the percolator her grandmother had used for so many years that the inside had stained to a permanent dark brown. The coffee tasted like the farmhouse smelled functional, stripped of decoration, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She wrapped both hands around the mug and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the equipment shed. The south wall had buckled at the base over the winter, the corrugated roofing peeled away from the purlins, come down across whatever was stored underneath at roughly a 30-degree angle. She'd been telling herself she would get to it since she arrived. She had not gotten to it. She got to it the next morning. The disc harrow was under the collapsed sheeting, intact but buried. The Ford 3000 sat in the back of the shed, dusty but structurally sound. A single-axle spreader with a cracked handle leaned against the north wall. The disc harrow had a sheared gang bolt before the collapse, or after she couldn't determine, and the 6th bearing on the frame was dry catching when she spun it by hand. She made a list on the back of the soil test printout. Roof sheeting. Gang bolt, grease, tractor unknown condition. Lists were how she kept the problem from being one problem. She was making a lot of them. In the second week of December, 3 people told her in 3 different ways to consider selling. Her grandmother's lawyer, a man named Collins in Greenville, said the market for agricultural parcels in Darke County was stable, that the acreage, while not premium ground, would attract buyers, that she should consider her options before committing to anything requiring capital she didn't have. He said it with professional patience. A woman from her grandmother's church brought a casserole to the farmhouse and mentioned after setting it on the counter that she knew a family from the congregation looking to expand their operation. She said it with genuine kindness. She wasn't wrong about the kindness. She was wrong about what Hollis needed. The third was a man at Burkhart's Farm Supply in Arcanum, where Hollis had gone to price lime spreaders. He'd overheard her at the counter, leaned against the end of the aisle, told her the east field he'd driven past it since he was a boy was about as far gone as ground could get without being strip mined, that whoever had worked it without mercy, that a 19-year-old girl with no farming background was going to find the numbers very hard to make work. He said it as fact, not cruelty. That almost made it worse than cruelty would have been. She drove home in this dark. She turned the radio off and drove in silence, thinking about the word gone. Whether a thing that had been alive could properly be called gone, or whether gone was only accurate for things that had never had the right conditions in the first place. She didn't have an answer. She went home and made more lists. January 12th fell on a Thursday. Hollis had made the appointment at Darke County Agricultural Lending 2 weeks before, after spending those 2 weeks at the Arcanum Public Library, typing a business plan on one of the 3 computers along the east wall. 17 pages, 15 cents per page to print. She'd stapled it twice because the first staple went in crooked. She drove the 9 miles to Greenville, parked on Main Street, sat in the truck for 4 minutes, went in. The building was brick 1960s construction with a low-drop ceiling and fluorescent lights that gave the air a slightly used quality. Gerald Fawcett had a desk with a clear plastic organizer holding pens. He didn't appear to use a monitor angled slightly away from visitors, the contained posture of a man who knows roughly where a conversation is going before it begins. She told him she was applying for a beginning farmer operating loan. She said she needed $31,000. She placed the folder on the desk between them. He didn't open it immediately. He asked a sequence of questions: how long she'd held the property, whether existing debt was attached to it, whether she had any farming income history. She answered each one clearly. He listened with the attention of someone cataloging rather than considering. When he opened the folder, he turned to the soil test first. She watched his face. His face didn't change in any direction. The figures here. He tapped the printout with one finger. A pH of 5.1 and organic matter at 0.4%. This is significantly below what we'd need to see to support a production loan. The land in its current condition doesn't appraise at a value that would secure the amount you're requesting. She asked what it would take to change that assessment. He looked at her with the steadiness of someone explaining policy, not making a judgment. Demonstrated production history, improved soil metrics over multiple seasons, evidence of capital investment resulting in measurable improvement. A pause that carried something in it. I'm sorry for your loss. I mean that sincerely. He closed the folder. The sound it made was small. He pushed it back across the desk toward her. Then he stood up. 22 minutes. She checked her phone when she got back to the truck. 12:47 in the afternoon. The folder was on the passenger seat, all 17 pages returned, without a mark on any of them. She sat looking at that fact, a man handing back 17 pages of her thinking without keeping a single one. And then she drove back north on State Route 49, turned onto County Road 25A, came into the farm lane. Eastfield on her right. Same gray stubble, same flat light. She pulled in and stopped and looked at it through the windshield for a while. Then she went inside. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder and read the 17 pages again from the beginning. Because that is what you do when the answer you came for doesn't arrive. You go back to the start of your own thinking and look for what you missed, what you got wrong, what you were asking for that was the wrong thing to ask. What she was looking for was a way to make the land serviceable without the loan. The loan had been the plan. The bank had taken 22 minutes to end the plan. She needed different arithmetic. She wrote numbers on the legal pad until close to midnight. Lime first, the extension printout, and the OSU bulletin she'd been ordering from Columbus. Both said the same thing without quite saying it directly at pH. 5.1 nutrients, lockup biology slows. The field sits chemically hostile. Anything planted into it uses its available energy trying to survive rather than establishing. You could spend money on seed and watch every dollar sit in the ground doing nothing. Lime was the admission price, not optional. She had called 3 suppliers and gotten quotes. The cheapest was a place out of Piqua Bulk Agricultural Limestone, $82 a ton delivered. The extension estimate for moving the pH meaningfully on 11 acres at that deficit was 12 to 16 tons. She used 14 as her working number. 14 times 82. She did that multiplication 4 times because she kept expecting the answer to change. $1,148 just for lime. Then spreader rental, fuel, seed, and she still didn't know exactly what she was planting. Only the outline of it. Cover crops, not row crops, nothing expensive. Something she could sell or something that built toward a saleable crop in a following season. She kept writing. The legal pad had 30 pages. She used most of the first one before the wind picked up outside. The farmhouse was old enough that wind found its thin places. There was a gap above the back bedroom window where the caulk had failed years before, and when the wind came from the northwest, it found that gap and made a low, unsteady sound that was almost like breathing, but less regular, the sound of something not quite finished. She sat at the table and listened to it, and thought about her grandmother living in these rooms for 50 years, measuring things, writing things down, keeping records the way that generation kept records, not for anyone else's use, just to know, to have the knowing located somewhere outside her own head, where she could return to it and check whether it was still true. The attic door was in the upstairs hallway behind a hook latch stiff from years of disuse. She'd walked past it every day since arriving. Every time she told herself she'd get to it. Every time she kept walking. That night, close to midnight, she lifted the hook. The stairs were steep bare pine, flexing under her weight near the top. She had to angle her shoulders through the doorframe. The attic smelled the way sealed old wood smells, dry, slightly sweet, the inside of a drawer that hasn't been opened since before you were born. No switch at the top. She used her phone, moving the beam across rafters, cardboard boxes along the knee wall, shapes covered in old sheets. Near the center of the space, a bare bulb on a cord. When she pulled it, 40 watts of yellow light held steady. Against the far wall under the slope of the roof sat a cedar chest. Low, about 4 feet long, brass hinges gone green at the joints. 3 letters burned into the lid, the last 2 were her grandmother's initials. Hollis stood in front of it for a moment. The wind found the roof somewhere above her, made the breathing sound again closer now. She opened the lid. Quilts on top, folded tight. Smelling of cedar and something floral. She needed a moment to name. Dried lavender. She thought something Cora had grown along the south wall of the kitchen garden, where the afternoon light held longest. Below the quilts, letters bundled with kitchen twine. Photographs face down. A pair of cotton work gloves stiff with age, the fingers permanently curved from decades of use into a shape that still suggested a hand reaching for something. Below all of that, placed flat against the bottom of the chest, with the deliberateness of something meant to be found, were 3 spiral-bound notebooks with dark green covers. She lifted the first one. Nothing written on the cover. She opened it. Small, precise handwriting. Pencil pressed hard enough that she could feel the grooves with her thumbnail. The date at the top of the first page, April 3rd, 1987. Below it, East Field, pH test South Quadrant. 6.2, drainage slow after frost. Will recheck May. She turned the page. A map hand-drawn in pencil. The East Field divided into a rough grid, each square labeled with a number, the margins filled with shorthand she'd have to learn. Abbreviation symbols, numbers without immediate context. But she recognized the field's shape, the low corner where water stood, the slight rise along the north edge. She had walked that ground enough times in 2 months to know its contours and the soles of her feet, and here it was on paper, measured and recorded by a woman who had been studying it since 5 years before Hollis was born. She hadn't left her land. She'd left her thinking, which was worth more. Hollis sat under the 40-watt bulb with the notebook across her knees and read until her back ached from the cold floor. She did not go to bed. When the first notebook ended, she opened the second and kept going. The second notebook started in March of 1994 and ran through 2001. 7 years in a single green cover, the pages thicker with use, the pencil marks darker where Cora had pressed harder when she had more to say. The shorthand had settled by then into a private language Hollis learned as she went. BR was buckwheat rotated in for phosphorus uptake. CC was crimson clover. A small triangle with a number meant drainage depth in inches. A circle with a cross marked a soil core sample site. She found a page from August 1998 where Cora had written the same 2 words 3 times in a row and underlined them each time. Watch drainage. Watch drainage. Watch drainage. Below that, a sketch of the low corner with a dotted line running toward it from the northwest, and a note tile collapse possible circa 1993. Hollis hadn't known there were drainage tiles beneath the field. She wrote it in her own notebook and kept reading. What Cora had done with the East Field across those first two notebooks was patient in a way that requires genuine discipline, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply shows up at the same task season after season and writes down what it finds. She had rotated cover crops through the East Field for 12 years before planting a single acre of cash corn. Clover for 2 seasons, fixing nitrogen through root nodulation. Buckwheat to fracture the compaction layer and draw phosphorus up from below. Winter rye to hold the soil structure through freeze and thaw. She had watched the pH the way a careful person watches a patient's temperature, checking it, often adjusting, recording the response. By the time she planted corn in 1999, the organic matter in the South Quadrant was at 3.1%. Hollis stopped at that number. She read it again. 3.1%. The East Field she'd inherited tested at 0.4. The difference between those two numbers wasn't just arithmetic. At 3.1%, soil holds moisture through a dry July rather than shedding it. At 3.1%, roots reach instead of stop at the hardpan. At 3.1%, the invisible biology, microbial networks, fungal threads, the slow patient work of earthworms through structure, is active, converting chemistry into something living. Things can use. At 0.4%, the field is nearly silent in every way that matters to anything trying to grow in it. Someone had taken what Cora built across 12 years and spent 4 growing seasons extracting everything she'd put in. Harlan Pruitt's operation. The contract signed in 2018 when Cora was already sick, when the lawyer who came to the farmhouse for the signing was not the one she trusted. Hollis didn't feel anger precisely. She felt something quieter and more useful, the particular clarity that arrives when a problem finally assumes its correct shape, when you can see exactly what it requires in what order, without the distortion of panic or grief blurring the edges. The path was already charted. Her grandmother had charted it. 22 years of patient pencil marks in 3 green notebooks, and the path was right there. She opened the third notebook. The third was different from the first two. The way a person changes between their 30s and their 50s, not unrecognizable, but more inhabited, more interior. The data entries were still there, still precise, still dated. But between them were paragraphs. Long ones, sometimes running 2 pages without a break, written in a smaller hand, as if Cora had been a little embarrassed by them, had tried to keep them from taking up too much room. The first paragraph Hollis found that stopped her was dated June 14, 2003. Cora had been out in the East Field at dawn, checking on a cover of hairy vetch that wasn't nodulating well. She'd looked up from where she was kneeling. She wrote and watched the light come across the field in a long, flat sheet, the way it does in late June, when the air is still and the sun is just clearing the tree line. She had written, "The field looked grateful. I know that is not a scientific observation. I am writing it down anyway." Hollis set the notebook on the cedar chest and pressed both hands flat against her knees and looked at the attic floor for a moment without seeing it. The 40-watt bulb hung steady above her. Outside, the February wind worked at the roof. She picked the notebook back up. There were other paragraphs scattered through the third notebook. Cora's worry that the drainage work along the northwest corner wouldn't hold in a wet spring. Notes from a conversation with a neighbor woman named Mabry Younger, someone who had brought a journal article from the OSU extension, and whom Cora described as someone who asked the right kind of questions, which was high praise in this handwriting. Calculations: if organic matter continued improving at roughly its rate since 1991, the East Field could be producing at close to 4% by 2015. Cora had underlined that number. She had wanted to reach it. The notebooks had stopped in 2009. The last entry was October 9, 2009. Cora was 61 when she wrote it. She would have been 71 when she sat at this same kitchen table and signed her name next to a lawyer she didn't know, and the 62 good acres went one direction while the 11 spent ones stayed. Hollis thought about what it meant to build something across 22 years carefully in cold and heat, kneeling in your own dirt and reading what the soil was telling you, and then watch it taken apart in 4 growing seasons by someone who measured the ground only in bushels. She thought about it for a while. Then she thought about what Cora had already proven: the East Field was not a dead field. It had been alive, which meant it could be alive again. She closed the third notebook. She set all three in a neat stack on top of the cedar chest. Outside the small attic window, the February sky was beginning to pale at the edges. Not light yet, just a reduction in darkness, the hour before dawn, in a county flat enough that you can see the darkness lifting from 20 miles away. She went downstairs. She found a pen in the kitchen drawer under a broken flashlight and a church directory from 2004. She pulled out the yellow legal pad and sat down at the table her grandmother had eaten at every morning of her adult life, and she made a list. Not a plan, a list of what she knew. She knew the pH was 5.1, and she knew from Cora's own records that 5.1 was correctable. Cora had brought the East Field from 5.3 to 6.7 between 1989 and 1991 by hauling lime herself and recording the pH shift across 3 patient seasons. She knew she needed approximately 14 tons for 11 acres at the current deficit that the Pequa supplier ran $82 a ton delivered. She wrote the number down and circled it. She knew the Ford 3000 needed to start, and that whether it would was a question for morning. She knew the disc harrow was accessible now that the roofing was cleared, that it needed a gang bolt and a bearing grease before it was operational. She knew the cover crop sequence from the notebooks and from the extension bulletins she'd been reading for 2 months. Winter rye first for structure through frost. Crimson clover for nitrogen fixation through nodulation. Buckwheat last after the soil warmed past 45 degrees to fracture the compaction layer and draw phosphorus up from depths row crops couldn't reach. She knew the clover seed should be inoculated before planting to improve establishment in compacted ground. She'd seen it implied in one of Cora's third notebook entries, a small notation about nodulation failure in an uninoculated test plot she'd run in 1996. At the bottom of the list, she wrote the name she'd found on the last page of the third notebook in Cora's hand, with a phone number and a single line of endorsement underlined, "Once honest people." Good germination. Ask for the winter rye blend. Eldon Kirby, Charm, Ohio. She looked at the list for a long time. The stove had burned low while she was in the attic. She fed it now 2 splits of oak, the damper open to draw. Outside, the February sky was going pale and flat. Above the East Field, the same sky it had always been above this ground, the same cold light arriving at the same low angle, across the same flat horizon her grandmother had looked at every morning for 50 years. She had a list. She had 3 green notebooks in 22 years of careful knowing. She had 11 acres of spent ground that had once been living ground, which meant it remembered how somewhere below the compaction and the atrazine and the 4-strip seasons. She had a tractor she hadn't started yet, a gang bolt that needed replacing, approximately $1,148 worth of lime she couldn't afford. The coffee reheated on the stove. She poured a cup and stood at the window and looked at the East Field in the first gray light and thought about what her grandmother had written in March of 1994. She'd found it in the second notebook in a year Cora had noted as difficult. This ground is tired, but tired is not dead. Tired just means it hasn't been given anything back yet. She stood there until the coffee was cool enough to drink. Then she sat back down at the table, pulled the legal pad toward her, wrote one more line at the bottom of the list below Eldon Kirby's name. Call in the morning. She left the list on the table and went to find a few hours of sleep before the morning came. The farmhouse settled around her in the February dark, the old wood making its slow sounds, the stove ticking as the firebox expanded with the new heat, the wind still working at the gap above the back bedroom window in that low, unsteady way. She lay in the dark and thought about 3.1%, about what her grandmother had built in 12 years of cover cropping and careful lime and patient watching, about what 4 seasons of extraction had taken, and what might, with the right sequence and enough patience, and 14 tons of agricultural limestone she didn't yet have the money for, be possible to bring back. The path was already charted. Someone had already done the hard work of finding it. All she had to do was follow it into whatever came next. The morning came the way February mornings come, in Dark County, without announcement, without color, the darkness simply thinning at the edges until the fields outside the window became visible shapes instead of suggestions. Hollis had slept 4 hours. She knew because she checked the clock when she lay down and checked it again when she sat up, and 4 was enough to function on, which was all she was asking of herself right now. She dressed in the dark. Wool socks, work pants, the flannel shirt she'd been rotating through the wash every 3 days since she arrived. She fed the stove before she did anything else. 2 splits of oak, the damper open to draw, because a cold house in February was a problem that compounded itself, and she had enough compounding problems already. The percolator went on. She stood at the kitchen window while it heated and looked at the east field in the first gray light. The legal pad still on the table behind her with Eldon Kirby's name at the bottom of the list. She waited until 7 before she called. The number had a 330 area code. It rang twice. The voice that answered was unhurried, the voice of a man who had been awake for hours already and wasn't surprised to have the phone ring. She told him she'd gotten his name from a family record. She told him she was looking at a spring planting of winter rye crimson clover and buckwheat on 11 acres in Darke County, that the soil was in poor condition, that she wanted good germination rates on the clover in particular because the ground had a compaction problem she was working around. Eldon Kirby asked 3 questions. What was her pH reading? Whether she had a roller or just a disc? Whether she was after a cash harvest this season or a pure soil building pass? She told him both. She needed to build the ground. She needed it to eventually produce something she could sell. She couldn't afford to do those things separately. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone calculating more, the silence of someone who has heard this kind of problem before and is deciding which version of the answer is most useful. If you're serious about the clover establishing in compacted ground, he said, you should consider inoculating the seed before you put it down. It costs a little more, but it cuts your establishment losses significantly. The rhizobia need to be present for nodulation to happen. In undisturbed soil, they're usually there. In ground that's been worked hard, you can't count on it. She wrote it down. She asked about the winter rye blend the family record had mentioned. He told her about it, a blend his family had been developing since the late 1990s, selected for cold germination and strong root development in clay-heavy soils. He gave her quantities for 11 acres. When she asked the price, the number he gave was lower than anything she'd found in the OSU extension catalog or on any of the supplier websites she'd spent evenings searching. She thanked him. She told him she'd call back by the end of February with a final order. She hung up and stood at the kitchen table with the legal pad in front of her. $387 for the full seed order if the quantities held. She wrote the number next to the circled line figure and looked at the 2 of them together. $1,535 in costs. She could name, not counting spreader rental, not counting fuel, not counting whatever the tractor was going to need to stay running through a full season of field work. She didn't have $1,535. She had a checking account with $12 in it and a grandmother's farm and 3 green notebooks that contained the only working plan she'd found in 2 months of looking. She put on her grandfather's barn coat. It had been hanging on the hook by the back door since she arrived, too large across the shoulders, smelling of diesel and something older she couldn't name, and went out to deal with the shed roof. The work took 2 full days. Cold metal and awkward angles and a pry bar that raised blisters on her right palm where the handle met the heel of her hand. She freed the collapsed sheeting in sections, dragging each piece through the gap in the south wall, stacking them along the fence line in the weeds. The work was simple in the way that hard physical labor is simple. 1 task at a time, 1 section at a time. No part of her mind required except the part that kept track of where the sharp edges were. By the afternoon of the 2nd day, she could see the disc harrow fully, and the relief she felt looking at it was the particular relief of a problem turning out different from what she'd feared. Not solved, just smaller than the version she'd been imagining. She drove the 7 miles to Burkhart's for the gang bolt. The man at the counter found the right size in a parts drawer without her having to describe it twice. $14. She drove back with the bolt in her coat pocket, turning it between her fingers, fixed it that evening by headlamp on the shed floor, threading it through the flange until it seated clean. Then she went through each of the disc harrow's blades by hand, spinning them to check the bearings. 5 moved freely. The 6th caught and ground. She worked grease into the housing with her thumb, pressing it in slowly until the catch released and the blade turned. She spun it 3 more times to be sure. She stood and looked at the Ford 3000 in the beam of the headlamp. It had not run since October. Whether it would run now was a question she'd been deferring for 2 weeks, the way you defer the questions whose answers could change the shape of everything. Morning. Below freezing the air in the shed visible when she breathed. She primed the fuel line the way her grandfather had shown her once when she was 11 years old, standing beside her in the same shed patient, explaining each step in the particular voice men use when they're teaching something they don't want forgotten. Unhurried, no flooding. Let the glow plug cycle twice before the key. She let the glow plug cycle twice. She turned the key. The engine turned over, twice caught, shuddered like something waking from a long, cold sleep, then settled into a low, uneven idle that smoothed itself out over 3 minutes as the oil warmed and reached the places it needed to reach. She sat in the cold seat with her hands on her thighs and let it run. The exhaust rose into the gray February air through the open shed door. There is a particular kind of relief that has nothing triumphant in it. The relief of a thing not being worse than you feared, the relief of one fewer problem rather than one victory gained. That was what she felt sitting on the Ford while it idled, the engine turning over steadily in the cold morning. She drove it out along the south perimeter of the east field. Not into the field, the ground was still frozen enough that she would have damaged what little soil structure remained, and she wasn't going to start this process by adding to the compaction she was trying to undo. Just along the fence line, the tractor pulling slightly left at the steering, the three-point hitch hydraulics responding slowly but responding. She noted both things in her notebook. She drove back to the shed and shut the engine down and sat on the mudguard for a while, looking east at the field in the thin morning light. The field looked exactly as it always looked. Brown, flat, not yet convinced by anything she'd done. She called Eldon Kirby back that afternoon with her final order. Winter rye, crimson clover, buckwheat, a small quantity of dwarf sunflower for the fence rows. He quoted $387 for the lot, same as before. She told him she'd send a money order by the end of the week. He said that was fine. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table with the 3 green notebooks open in front of her, the second one open to the page she kept returning to. March 1994. Written in a year Cora had described in her opening notation as difficult for the East Field, a year when drainage problems she'd been tracking for 6 years had finally forced a decision about tiling she couldn't yet afford. The entry was short. This ground is tired, but tired is not dead. Tired just means it hasn't been given anything back yet. Hollis closed the notebook and left it on the table. Mabry Caldwell came by on a Tuesday in the first week of March, 3 days after the seed boxes arrived on the porch. She pulled into the drive in an old green Subaru and did not announce herself with the horn. She simply stepped out and stood at the fence line looking at the east field until Hollis noticed her from the shed window and came out to meet her. Mabry was somewhere in her mid-60s with the physical quality of a woman who had worked outside for decades, not large, but settled into herself, moving with the economy of someone who had long since stopped wasting motion. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a folder of photocopied documents under her arm. She offered no explanation for arriving unannounced. She looked at Hollis for a moment, as if taking a measurement, then turned back to the field. "Your grandmother wrote me about you," she said, looking at the east field rather than at Hollis. "Years ago, she said you'd come back eventually." A pause. "I don't know that she meant under these circumstances." Hollis said she wasn't sure her grandmother had meant any particular circumstances. Mabry made a sound that might have been agreement and held out the folder. Inside were photocopied pages from the County NRCS Soil Survey, Darke County Edition, 1973, several sections marked with yellow tape. She had also included 2 printed pages from an OSU extension bulletin on cover crop sequencing in compacted clay soils. One of them the same bulletin Hollis had already ordered from Columbus, with different passages underlined. They walked the field together. Mabry moved without hurrying, stopping at intervals to look at the ground, occasionally crouching to press her fingers into the surface. At the low center of the field, the corner that appeared in every one of Cora's notebooks, the place where drainage had always been slow, the last area to release its frost, Mabry stopped and pointed toward the surface. "The compaction is worst here." Her voice was the voice of someone describing a patient's condition to another doctor, not to a family member. The anhydrous application sealed the top 6 inches across most of the field, but this zone held water on top of the seal, and the freeze-thaw cycling made it worse. Whatever microbial activity was left in the rest of the field probably isn't present here at all. She straightened. You're going to need to double your clover rate in this area. The nodulation won't take on the first planting. You'll be seeding for the second-year establishment as much as the first. Hollis wrote it in her notebook. Mabry looked at the writing for a moment, then back at the field. Buckwheat, she said as if arriving at something she'd been turning over. It's the oldest remediation tool there is. Farmers used it before anyone had a word like remediation. The root structure fractures hardpan, and the plant pulls phosphorus up from depths corn roots can't reach. Your grandmother knew this. A pause. She also knew it requires patience, because buckwheat won't tell you anything useful for 6 weeks after germination. You have to be comfortable not knowing for a while. She said it as a fact, not encouragement or warning. That made it worth more than either would have been. She left without staying for coffee, without looking back at the field from the car, without any of the gestures that would have made the visit feel like something other than what it was, a professional assessment delivered by someone who had known Cora Vane for 30 years and had decided for reasons she didn't explain to extend the same attention to the granddaughter. After the Subaru turned out of the drive, Hollis opened the canvas bag Mabry had left on the fence post. Inside, along with the folder, was a small paper sack of boiled peanuts, still faintly warm through the paper. She stood at the fence line and ate a few, looking at the east field in the early March light, thinking about the word patience, about what it required and what it cost, and whether she had enough of it to do what needed doing across however many seasons this was going to take. The seed boxes had been on the kitchen table for 3 days. She went inside and opened them. 2 flat boxes packed carefully, each packet labeled in a clean hand. She counted the packets against her order. Everything was there. $387 of seed for 11 acres of ground the bank had appraised at nothing. She set the packets in a cool corner, away from the wood stove, and went back out to the shed to look at the tractor again. There was work coming, not in weeks, in days. The ground was already beginning, slow as it was, to change its temperature. She watched the weather station out of Arcanum every evening on her phone. In late March, the nighttime low stopped going below 20 degrees. The first week of April, she pushed a soil thermometer borrowed from Mabry with a single phone call that Mabry answered on the second ring, and ended without pleasantries down to 4 inches in the center of the east field, and read the number 41 degrees. Too cold for buckwheat, not too cold for rye. Cora's notebooks had a note on this, written in March of 1994, under a hand-drawn thermometer with degree marks scratched along the side. 3 words: don't chase warm, let warm find you. Hollis had read those 3 words every morning for 8 days. She understood them now, not as patience in the abstract, but as a specific technical instruction. Seeding buckwheat before the soil hit 45 degrees at 4 inches was not early planting. It was wasted seed. The rye and clover had different thresholds. The rye didn't care much about cold. It would germinate in near freezing conditions if the seed-to-soil contact was right. The clover needed a little more. The buckwheat needed 45 minimum, 45 at 4 inches, meaning a soil mass that had been warming long enough to sustain that temperature through the night. April 9th was a Tuesday. The soil thermometer read 42 degrees at 7 in the morning, the sky clear for the first time in 10 days, the wind out of the south for once, instead of the northwest. She hitched the Gandy spreader to the 3-point hitch and loaded the rye seed. The disc harrow she'd run across the field twice in the last week of March, once north to south, and once on the diagonal, breaking the surface crust enough to create seed-to-soil contact without going deep enough to bring the worst of the hardpan up. The field was not ready in any meaningful agricultural sense, but it was as ready as she could make it, and winter rye was forgiving in ways that most things weren't. She drove the Ford 3000 in long passes across the east field, east to west, the spreader laying seed at 90 pounds per acre across the full 11 acres. She could feel the compaction through the tractor's movement, a slight stutter when a wheel caught a denser layer, a resistance that translated up through the seat and into her back in a way that reminded her every few minutes of what she was working against. By midday, the rye was down. The crimson clover went in on April 15th, a Saturday, the temperature at 53 degrees by noon. Clover seed was smaller than the rye lighter, slower to establish, but each root node would eventually be trading with the soil biology in ways she wouldn't see for weeks. Nitrogen fixed from the air converted by rhizobia bacteria living in the nodules released into the soil in forms that subsequent crops could access. She doubled the rate along the low center section where Mabry had pointed. That was her addition to the plan, her own pencil marks in her own notebook, her own decision made from her own reading of the ground. Not from the notebooks, from herself. The buckwheat waited. She checked the soil thermometer every morning. April 19th, 43 degrees. April 22nd, 42. April 24th. The reading jumped to 47 at noon. She went out to the middle of the field in the afternoon, knelt in the broken ground, pushed the thermometer down to 4 inches, 45.2. She stayed crouching for a moment, looking at the number. The field around her was bare brown ground, still showing the disc marks from March the rye not yet visible, the clover invisible. 11 acres of ground that showed nothing yet of what she'd put into it. That was enough. 45.2 was enough. She seeded the buckwheat on the morning of April 25th, working east to west, so the low April sun was at her back. The buckwheat seed was small, pale, almost translucent when it caught the morning light scattering off the spreader. It looked like something being returned to the field rather than placed in it, like something finding its way back to where it had always been supposed to go. She drove slower than the work required. Maybe it was that she understood, in a way she hadn't fully articulated before climbing onto the tractor that morning, that this was the last moment before something was either going to work or wasn't. The last moment of pure intention before consequence began. By noon, all 3 species were in the ground. She drove the Ford back to the shed and climbed down and sat on the mudguard with her hands loose in her lap, looking east across the 11 acres. The field looked exactly as it had before she started. Brown, flat, giving nothing away. She stayed there for a while. The sun was past its midday angle, the light beginning to flatten the way it flattened here in the afternoon. To the north, she heard a truck engine, the particular sound of a vehicle slowing without stopping, without turning in. She didn't move from the mudguard. She'd learned to recognize the sound of Harlan Pruitt's truck by the way it paced on the gravel, the way it decelerated with a patience that was its own kind of pressure. He drove past. The engine returned to normal speed. The gravel dust rose and drifted and settled back across the fence line. She climbed down from the mudguard. She went inside. She made coffee and opened her notebook to the next blank page and wrote the date at the top. April 25th, all 3 down. Below that, she wrote what she actually meant, crossing out the first attempt, now we watch. The difference between waiting and watching was something she was still learning. Waiting was passive, a form of suspension. Watching was a practice, the thing her grandmother had done across 22 years of notebook entries, going out to the field in all weather, crouching at the soil surface, reading what was there. Watching required the willingness to see what was actually happening rather than what you hoped was happening. Those were not always the same thing, and confusing them was how you made decisions based on the field you wanted rather than the field you had. May came slow and deliberate, the way May always comes in this part of Ohio. One warm day followed by 2 cold ones, the soil temperature rising and falling, the biological activity starting and pausing like an engine that keeps needing to be convinced. She went out to the east field every morning. She carried her notebook. She crouched at different points across the 11 acres and looked at the soil surface and wrote down what she saw. May 9th, she found the first crimson clover breaking ground in the south quadrant, 2 small leaves, pale and tentative, barely an inch of stem, lifting them above the soil surface. She crouched in the mud and looked at them for a long time without writing anything. They were there. They were alive. The inoculated seed was establishing in compacted ground that an extension agent had told her in November might not support cover crop germination. She wasn't ready to call it a victory. She'd read enough of Cora's notebooks to know that germination was only the first question, and that the questions following it, establishment root, development, nodulation, second leaf emergence, each had their own threshold and their own way of failing. But she wrote it down. May 9th, first clover, south quadrant, 2 leaves. The rye had been visible since the last week of April. Fine green lines threading across the turned soil in rows that followed the direction she'd seeded. By late May, it had thickened into something that looked like actual intention. Not a full cover yet, but organized, purposeful, the kind of growth that suggests the ground is cooperating rather than merely tolerating. She wrote that down too. Late May, rye establishing across full field, thicker in north half, slower in south. Check south drainage. The buckwheat flowered in late June. She came out one morning and the field had changed overnight in the way fields sometimes change, not gradually, but across a threshold. Some invisible line crossed the upper portions of the buckwheat plants, white with small clustered flowers that caught the early light and turned the fence rows luminous. The dwarf sunflowers she'd seeded along the south fence had reached knee height, their faces tracking east in the morning the way sunflowers do, turning through the day on some schedule she never tired of watching. Mabry walked the field with her twice that summer. She came both times without calling ahead, appeared at the fence line in the morning, moved in silence through the rows with her hands occasionally dropping to touch a plant or lift a leaf, said little. The first time she crouched at the south quadrant where Hollis had doubled the clover rate and studied the nodulation forming on the roots she'd exposed by carefully lifting a plant from the edge of the section. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, better than I expected for first season. She set the plant back in the ground with the care of someone returning something borrowed. Hollis understood she wasn't being given encouragement. She was being given a calibrated assessment from someone who had been reading this ground for nearly as long as Cora had, and calibrated assessments from Mabry Caldwell were worth more than enthusiasm from anyone else. The second time Mabry came was in August, 2 weeks before the soil sample results were due back from Worcester. She walked the full field without stopping, then stood at the north fence line and looked south across the growth. The buckwheat going to seed, now the clover thick and dark green, holding the morning dew. Until mid-morning, the rye having completed its purpose and beginning to die back in the summer heat. She was quiet for a long time. Your grandmother would have been interested in this, she said, not to Hollis specifically, more to the field itself. She had a theory about first-season recovery rates in clay soils. She thought the literature underestimated them. A pause. She might have been right. She left without explaining more. Hollis didn't ask her to. Harlan Pruitt drove past the field 4 times between May and the end of August. She knew his truck by the sound it made on the gravel and the quality of its slowness. Not the slowness of someone who had a reason to stop, but the slowness of someone whose calculations were being revised by what he was seeing. The first time she'd noticed it in April, she'd felt something tighten in her chest that she'd identified after a moment as not fear, but proximity, the awareness of being observed by someone whose interest in what she was doing was not neutral. By August, she'd stopped feeling it. By August, she simply heard the truck slow and noted it in the same flat register she used to note the soil temperature or the clover leaf count. He was watching. She was working. Those were different activities with different outcomes. She sent the soil sample to the Worcester lab on August 4th. She'd taken the core samples herself the way Vernon Hatch had shown her in November, 4 quadrants, even intervals, each one labeled and bagged. She sealed the mailer at the kitchen table with the 3 green notebooks stacked at the corner where they'd been sitting since February, where she'd come to think of them as a kind of presence rather than just objects. She'd read them a combined 4 times by then. She knew them in the way you know something that has reorganized the way you think. The results came back on August 19th, a single envelope in the mailbox at the end of the farm lane. She carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, put the kettle on. She stood at the window and looked at the east field for a moment, the buckwheat standing full and going to seed the clover thick and dark green, the whole 11 acres visibly alive in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd seen it in January. She opened the envelope. pH 6.4, organic matter 1.9%. She sat down. She read the 2 numbers again separately to make sure she was reading them correctly. pH 6.4 up from 5.1 in November, past the threshold where nutrients unlocked past the point where the biology became functional, into the range where established cover crops could feed the soil instead of just surviving in it. Organic matter 1.9% up from 0.4%, in 8 months. The number on that paper wasn't a miracle. It was arithmetic, cold weather arithmetic, done right. She sat with the result in her hand and thought about what it had taken. 14 tons of agricultural limestone sourced on credit against a seed contract she hadn't yet signed. $387 of seed from a family in Charm, Ohio, mailed in flat boxes left on the porch without knocking. A tractor with a steering pull to the left she'd learned to compensate for without thinking about it. A disc harrow with a replaced gang bolt and one re-greased bearing. 2 days of pry bar work in February cold. 8 days of watching the soil thermometer and not planting before the ground was ready. Not a miracle. A sequence. Her grandmother's sequence executed with her grandmother's tools on her grandmother's ground. But also hers now. The doubling of the clover rate in the south section had been her decision. The timing of the buckwheat seeding had been her read of the thermometer, her judgment about when 45 degrees meant 45 degrees. The sequence had been Cora's. The execution had been Hollis. She set the result on the table next to the green notebooks and picked up her phone. She sent Vernon Hatch an email with the numbers attached. Then she sat back and looked at the field through the kitchen window and listened to the August afternoon move through the old farmhouse, the way summer afternoons do, slowly finding all the places where the walls had thinned over a century of seasons. His reply came 20 minutes later. One line, good numbers. Keep going. No acknowledgement of what he'd said in November about the field's condition. No revision of anything. Just the assessment, which in Vernon Hatch's register was the equivalent of something longer from anyone else. She didn't need more than that. She picked up her notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. August 19th, pH 6.4, OM 1.9. Below that, she wrote the name she'd looked up 2 weeks earlier, Millbrook Artisan Grain Company, Ashford County. She drew a circle around it. Then she picked up her phone and made the call. The Millbrook representative came out on September 14th. He arrived in a company truck, clean but not new, and introduced himself as Garrett before walking the field without waiting for her to lead. She followed. He moved through the buckwheat going to seed and the clover still thick and dark at the soil surface, with the focused attention of someone who has walked a great many fields and learned to read them quickly, crouching twice to examine root structure, once to press his fingers into the soil surface and feel the give. He didn't say much while he walked. At the north fence line, he stopped and looked back south across the full 11 acres and was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone doing arithmetic in their head. Winter rye and crimson clover seed. Not a question. He'd seen the crop mix from 50 feet away. First season planting on reclaimed ground. She told him yes. She told him what the soil had tested at in November and what it was testing at now. He looked at her when she said the November number, then looked back at the field. They negotiated for 40 minutes at the kitchen table. The rye seed and the clover seed were what Millbrook wanted. The artisan grain market for small-scale cover crop seed had been tightening for 3 years, and first-generation seed from a field with documented soil improvement had a particular value to buyers paying attention to provenance. Garrett laid out the contract terms with the directness of someone who respected the other party's time. She read it twice. She asked 2 questions. He answered both without hedging. They settled on terms that would net her $4,200 by the end of October harvest. After he left, she sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything. $4,200 from 11 acres of ground that had appraised at nothing in January. Not a windfall. Not enough to change the fundamental arithmetic of the farm situation on its own. But enough to pay what she owed, keep what she needed, prove the one thing that needed proving, that the ground could produce, that the sequence had worked. That her grandmother's notebooks were not a record of what had once been possible, but a map of what was still possible now on this ground with these tools in this county. She owed the Pequa lime supplier $1,400 on a net 30 agreement she'd arranged in February when she couldn't pay up front, and the supplier, an older man who'd known Cora by name, had written the terms on a paper invoice and handed it to her without comment. She owed Burkhart's a smaller amount on account. She owed the spreader rental company in Arcanum $60 she'd been carrying since April. She wrote the figures in her notebook, subtracted them from $4,200, looked at what remained. It wasn't much, it was enough. The harvest came in the last week of October. Garrett sent 2 people from Millbrook with the right equipment, and she worked alongside them for 2 days, and at the end of the second day, the field was cut. The seed was in the Millbrook truck. She had a signed receipt in her notebook. The east field stretched bare again in the late October light stubble and turned soil looking in some ways like it had looked in January. Not exactly like January. The color was different. The gray-brown of January had been the color of something exhausted and chemically depleted. The brown of late October was warmer, darker, carrying in its surface the visible evidence of what the cover crops had done. Organic material, incorporated structure, opened by buckwheat roots, the soil surface crumbling rather than sheeting when she walked it. She crouched at the field's center and pressed her fingers in. The give was different from what she'd felt in March. The soil moved rather than resisted. It had in some real and measurable sense changed. She sent Eldon Kirby a check for the seed order she'd paid with a money order in the spring. She included a handwritten note telling him the germination rates had been what he'd promised. The clover had established well in the compacted section. With inoculation, the buckwheat had done what buckwheat does. She told him she'd be calling again in the spring. He wrote back on a note card in a hand as deliberate as her grandmother's had been. Glad to hear it. We'll be here. She pinned the note card to the wall above the kitchen table next to the NRCS soil survey pages Mabry had marked with yellow tape, next to the harvest receipt from Millbrook, next to the copy of the November soil test she'd been looking at every morning for 11 months. The envelope from Harlan Pruitt arrived in the first week of November. Standard business envelope, a law firm's name printed in the upper left corner. Inside a single page. An offer to purchase the Eastfield parcel, 11 acres at a price that was 3 times the county's most recent assessed value. She read it once. She set it on the kitchen table. She made coffee, drank half of it, standing at the window, looking at the Eastfield in the early November light, then sat back down and read the letter again. 3 times assessed value. The assessed value had been established when the soil tested at 0.4% organic matter and pH 5.1, when the county's assessment reflected what the field was worth to anyone who understood those numbers, which was close to nothing as agricultural ground. 3 times close to nothing was still a number that told her what Pruitt thought the field was worth, which was the number he'd calculated before she started, before the lime, before the cover crops, before the soil tested back into a range where production agriculture was possible. He'd watched from the road for 6 months. He'd seen the field change. He'd done his recalculation and arrived at this offer, and the offer told her everything she needed to know about how he'd been watching as someone waiting for her to fail, who had now recognized she wasn't going to, and had adjusted his arithmetic accordingly. Not generosity, recalculation. The same arithmetic he'd always been doing, just updated with new inputs. She took a notepad from the kitchen drawer. She wrote 2 sentences. She did not explain herself further. There was no explanation. She owed him no accounting of the 11 months that would have meant anything to someone who measured ground only in purchase price and harvest yield. She folded the paper, put it in an envelope, wrote the law firm's return address on the front. She drove to the post office in Arcanum the next morning and mailed it on her way to Burkhart's to settle her account. The man at Burkhart's counter ran her account balance without comment and took her payment and gave her a receipt. She folded the receipt and put it in her notebook. She drove home. The east field on her right as she came off County Road 25A. The November light settling low and flat across the stubble rows, the way it had settled across them when she'd first stood at the fence line a year ago. The same light, different ground. Vernon Hatch called her the second week of November. She hadn't expected to hear from him by phone. Their communication had been email since August, brief exchanges about the test results and a question she'd sent him about winter rye overseeding rates for the following spring. He called on a Wednesday afternoon, and she answered in the shed where she'd been checking the Ford's hydraulic fluid level before the temperature dropped. He said he'd been looking at her August results and comparing them to the November baseline. He said the rate of improvement in a single growing season was unusual enough that he'd shared the data anonymized with a colleague at the OSU Extension Office in Columbus who worked on soil remediation research. He said his colleague had expressed interest in the site for a longer-term study if she was amenable. She asked what that would mean practically. Periodic soil sampling over 3 to 5 years. They'd send someone for the sampling. You'd have access to the analysis at no cost. Your data would contribute to the research base on Cover crop remediation rates in compacted clay soils in western Ohio. A pause. Your grandmother's approach, the sequencing she used, it's not widely documented. Not at this scale, not with this kind of before and after record. It's worth documenting properly. She said she'd think about it. She meant yes, but she wasn't ready to say yes to anything requiring her to think beyond the next season yet. The next season was what she could see. The season after that was still just a shape. She thanked Vernon Hatch. He said she was welcome. There was a brief silence in which she thought he might say something else, might reference November, might reference what he'd handed her across his desk and what his face had done when she'd asked about organic matter levels and what the answer had cost him to give honestly. He didn't. He said good luck with the winter prep and hung up. She stood in the shed with her phone in her hand and looked at the Ford 3000 in the afternoon light coming through the open door. The tractor had run reliably since February. The steering still pulled left. She'd compensated for it so many times that the correction had become automatic, her hands making the adjustment before her mind registered the pull. She thought about that for a moment, about the things you learn to compensate for until the compensation becomes invisible, becomes just the way you hold yourself, becomes the particular angle at which you've learned to move through the world in order to move through it straight. She went back inside. The USDA letter came on November 17th, a Saturday. She found it in the mailbox at the end of the farm lane when she went down to collect the week's mail, mixed in with a farm supply catalog and a utility bill. The envelope had the agency's seal on the front. She carried it back to the house without opening it, set it on the kitchen table, took off her coat, fed the stove. Then she sat down and opened it. Beginning farmer operating loan, $31,500. Approved. She read the approval letter through once slowly, then set it on the table. She sat with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the letter. The kitchen was quiet around her. The stove ticked. Outside, the November wind moved across the flat ground of Darke County the way it always moved, without ceremony, without pause, finding no obstacle significant enough to change its course. $31,500. $500 more than she'd asked Gerald Fawcett for in January. The difference wasn't meaningful in any practical sense. It was simply the difference between what she'd calculated she needed and what the USDA's own analysis had determined was appropriate. And the fact that those two numbers were close meant she'd done her arithmetic right, which was its own small confirmation. She thought about the folder, the 17 pages she'd printed at 15 cents each at the Arcanum Library, stapled twice because the first staple went in crooked, placed on Gerald Fawcett's desk, and returned to her unmarked 22 minutes later. She still had it. It was in the kitchen drawer under the broken flashlight and the church directory from 2004, where she'd put it the night she came home from the bank and started writing numbers on the legal pad until midnight. She hadn't looked at it since February. She got up and found it in the drawer. She sat back down and opened it. The business plan was for a farm that didn't exist yet. When she wrote it, a projection, a set of assumptions about what ground at 0.4% organic matter might do under the right conditions, built from extension bulletins and seed catalogs, and the half-understood soil science she'd been teaching herself from books ordered through the OSU library system. Reading it now was like reading a letter from someone she'd been once and no longer was entirely. The assumptions had been right, not precise. The actual numbers were different from the projected numbers in both directions, some better, some worse, but structurally right. The sequence her grandmother had documented had worked the way her grandmother had documented it working. The ground had responded the way responsive ground responds when you give it what it's been depleted of. None of it had been certain in January. All of it had turned out to be true. She put the folder back in the drawer. She put the USDA letter on the stack with the soil test results and the Millbrook harvest receipt and Vernon Hatch's email printed out and the note card from Eldon Kirby and the NRCS survey pages Mabry had marked. She put on her coat and boots and went outside. The November light was doing what it always did in Darke County, at this hour settling low and flat across the fields, the color of pewter, the color of a patience that doesn't require acknowledgement. She walked to the east fence line. The field stretched out from the posts in its late-season state, the cover crop stubble turned under during harvest, the surface rough with the evidence of the season's work. The frost was in the ground already shallow, working itself out every morning slowly. From the surface down, releasing as the temperature climbed past freezing in the early afternoon. She had learned to ride that. The way the frost released first along the slight north ridge and last in the low center following the drainage gradient her grandmother had mapped in the first notebook in 1987. The way the soil color darkened as the frost left it, the darker color indicating moisture retention that hadn't been there a year ago. Small things, specific things. The kind of things that only become visible once you've been watching the same piece of ground long enough to know what it looked like before. She stood at the fence line for a while. The wind came from the northwest the way it came most days in November, flat and steady, finding no significant resistance between her and the horizon. To the north faintly, she could hear the sound of equipment on Pruitt's bottomland, a tractor in the distance, the 62 acres with their drainage tile and their river deposit loam. She heard it. She registered it the way she registered the weather or the frost depth. Information about the world she was operating in, nothing that required a response. She thought about her grandmother standing at this same fence line. The notebooks didn't record it directly, but it was there between the entries in the way Cora had mapped this field, with the attention of someone who looked at it often, in the way her notes from the late 1980s described the East Field's condition, with the intimacy of someone who had watched it through many seasons before she started writing things down. Cora had stood here, had looked at this same ground in this same light, had decided in some November that Hollis couldn't know the exact date of that, the field was worth the time it would take to understand it properly. She hadn't won the land back. She'd learned it the way her grandmother always said land had to be learned. Hollis didn't know if her grandmother had ever said that in those exact words. She'd found versions of it scattered through the notebook's observations about the difference between working ground and understanding it, between farming for the season and farming for the decade. But she understood it now the way you understand something only after you've done the thing it describes. After the knowledge has moved from your head into your hands and your back, and the particular way you stood on this soil, slightly forward on the balls of her feet, the way she'd learned to stand on soft ground without compressing it unnecessarily. That adjustment had become unconscious somewhere in June. She hadn't noticed when. The light was going. November light in Dark County went fast once it started dropping in the last hour of the afternoon with a speed that always caught her slightly off guard, the fields going from illuminated to dim in the time it took to walk back to the house. She stayed a little longer anyway. The stove was fed. The letter was on the table. The 3 green notebooks were back in the cedar chest on the attic floor where she'd returned them in October. The brass hinges cleaned a verdigris with a cloth before she closed the lid. Her own notebook, the one she'd started in February, the one that was now most of the way through its pages, was on the kitchen table open with the pen clipped to the cover. The east field held the last of the light a moment longer than the ground around it. The way ground that has been worked holds heat differently from ground that hasn't. She noticed that. She filed it in the part of her mind where the field's particular behaviors lived, now stacked alongside the frost patterns in the drainage lines and the way the buckwheat had flowered earlier in the south quadrant than the north. The field was teaching her things she hadn't known to ask about yet, that she understood now was how it was supposed to work. You didn't come to the ground knowing what questions to ask. The ground told you. She turned from the fence line and walked back to the house. Inside, she took off her coat and boots. She fed the stove a third split. The temperature was dropping faster tonight, the forecast calling for the season's first hard freeze by morning. She filled the kettle. While she waited for it, she stood at the kitchen table and looked at the items arranged there. The USDA letter, the stack of documents, the soil test results from November and August side by side. Her notebook open to the last entry she'd made. October 28th. Harvest complete. Field in. Wait for spring. She crossed out wait and wrote watch above it the way she'd done in April. Then she turned to the next blank page and wrote the date at the top. November 17th. Below it, $31,500 approved. She sat for a moment with the pen in her hand. The kettle started its sound. She got up and made tea in a tin of chamomile she'd found in the cabinet above the stove, her grandmother's old enough that the tin had gone slightly soft at the seam, smelling of dried flowers and something faintly sweet underneath. She wrapped both hands around the mug, and the warmth moved into her palms, the way warmth does when you've been outside long enough to need it. She sat back down. She thought about what her grandmother had written in June of 2003, the entry that had stopped her in the attic on a cold February night that felt like a different life now. The field looked grateful. I know that is not a scientific observation. I am writing it down anyway. Hollis looked out the dark window at where the east field was. She picked up the pen. She wrote one word below the date in the loan number. Same. Then she set the pen down and picked up the mug and held it with both hands while the first hard freeze of the season settled over Dark County without ceremony, without announcement, the way all the important things had come this year quietly and in the dark and right on time.